If you're anything like me, you probably have a lot of files such as video clips, audio recordings, and large creative projects that you would like to store securely. You might even want to be able to access these files from multiple computers or servers on your network. In this video, we're going to convert this nearly 10-year-old desktop into an impressive but affordable NAS by making a few upgrades and then installing TrueNAS. Stick around to see how. If you've watched some of my other videos, you've probably seen this HP Pavilion 500-C60 as I've featured this thing a ton on my channel. It has a quad-core AMD A6 5200 APU, which is clocked at 2 GHz and includes 8 GB of DDR3 memory. It's important to note that this motherboard doesn't support gigabit Ethernet and instead only supports 100 megabit per second Ethernet, but we'll come back to that later. Because this board technically uses a mobile APU, it barely sips any power from the wall using this external power supply, and the minimal power draw is exactly why I chose this machine for building a 24/7 NAS. I picked this specific PC up for around $30 after having to buy a replacement power supply, but these often go for around $100 on eBay. There are plenty of other options for a build like this though, and I'm really just making this video to demonstrate what you can do with an older desktop that you might have lying around the house or that you can find for a good deal used. Just know that your mileage may vary if you follow along with what I'm doing. My goal with this machine is to actually match the performance of a Synology NAS that I use in my house. It's the Synology DS215 Plus, which is an older 2-bay model that I bought refurbished. It, as well as some of the other models around this time period, often go for well over $100 on the used market still. To make our system comparable, we're going to add these two 4TB Seagate NAS drives. Now, you might be thinking, wait, I thought this was going to be a budget system. And that's fair, because these two drives probably cost more than twice as much as what I spent on everything else in this system. But the reason that I chose these is because these are actually two identical drives to what I'm running in the Synology, and so I wanted to have a pretty fair comparison. You can use any size drives you want, but you'll want to make sure they are of the exact same capacity, and it's even better if they're the same model. In this HP Pavilion, there's only one space in the case to put a 3.5-inch drive, so I'm taking out the optical drive and using this 5.25 to 3.5-inch adapter to mount our second hard drive in the system. I'm going to use this ADATA SU800 SSD as the boot drive to install TrueNAS 2, but if you remember from any previous videos, this motherboard only has 2 SATA ports. So this is where things start to get a bit janky. I'm going to use this USB 3 to SATA adapter to connect our SSD to one of the USB 3.0 ports on the back of the motherboard by feeding it through a slot on the back of the case. TrueNAS clearly doesn't recommend this, but oh well. If your board has 3 or more SATA ports, just use those. Another small issue is that because of our 5.25-inch bay adapter, our front panel cover just slightly doesn't fit anymore, so we'll just have to leave that off for now. And then remember that 100 megabit per second NIC I mentioned earlier? Well, that's going to be an issue because all of our transfers will be limited to 1/10 of what they could be on a gigabit connection. To combat this, we're going to attempt to use a USB 3 to gigabit adapter on the other USB 3.0 port. I considered adding 8 more gigabytes of RAM, but I decided to try to keep costs down, and adding more RAM should be pretty simple to upgrade later on if we decide to do it. Now, it's time to go ahead and install TrueNAS. And this is where I ran into some more issues when I tried testing this setup. I was planning on using TrueNAS Core, which is based on BSD, not Linux. And I think it's because of this that I could never get my USB to Ethernet adapter to work. I never even got a flashing light on the port or anything. Because I had luck with this exact same adapter when using Ubuntu, I decided to try out TrueNAS Scale, which is a bit newer and is actually built on Debian Linux. I at least got a blinking light on the adapter this time, but still couldn't get it to work. I was persistent though, and after trying not 1, not 2, but 3 different adapters, I finally found one that actually worked. So for this project, I am using TrueNAS Scale rather than TrueNAS Core, but you might still be able to use Core and follow along, but no guarantees. Now before we actually start with installing TrueNAS, I want to give a massive disclaimer. I am by no means an expert when it comes to Linux, network attached storage, or TrueNAS. This is actually my first venture into TrueNAS, and while it's been a lot of fun so far, I'm bound to make plenty of mistakes or do something that might not be common practice. If you work in IT or have a lot of experience with this type of project, please leave some helpful criticism in the comments. I'll try to pin any helpful comments so that they're pretty easy to find. To get started, we're going to search for TrueNAS and head to their website so that we can find a download link for TrueNAS Scale. Here you can either sign in or create an account, or just go down to the bottom and hit the no thank you button, and that should take you to the download link. While this is downloading, we can go ahead and get Rufus installed, which is what we're going to use to create our USB installer. To do that, just Google Rufus, click on their website, and then scroll down to where you can see the most recent download link. Okay, so we're in our downloads folder here, and we can go ahead and open up Rufus 3.17. But actually before we do that, we need to plug in our flash drive. So I have a 16 gig flash drive that I'm going to use here, so I'm just going to plug this into my system. Okay, so once we have our flash drive plugged in, under device right here, you should be able to see your flash drive. And then here where it says boot selection, we're going to say disk or ISO image. And then when we hit select, we can find, let me go to my downloads folder here and select TrueNAS Scale. And then all of the rest of this should default to the correct, or what we want to go with for this. So we'll go ahead and hit start. We should get a warning here. We can just go with this recommended option. It'll give us another warning that we're going to delete everything off of this flash drive, and we'll hit yes. And then this will take a while for it to delete everything off the flash drive and then create our installable media. But after a few minutes, we can come back to it and get TrueNAS installed. Okay, now that we're done, we can hit close and eject the drive right there. Now we can go ahead and unplug that drive from our computer and plug it into our soon-to-be NAS. After booting it up, you should see this small screen where you can just select Start Installation. After a little bit of gibberish, we'll eventually get to another page where we can go ahead and start installing. I'm also going to apologize now for using a camera because my capture card didn't really work well with this installer. Once we arrive at this screen, we can go ahead and hit enter on install/upgrade. Then here we'll need to select the drive that we want to install it to, and so we can find our 120 gig SSD, hit spacebar to select it, and then hit enter. Now I actually already had an installation on this when I was testing, so I'm being prompted here to do a fresh install. Otherwise it might just take you past the screen, but I'm going to hit fresh install. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit format the boot device. There will be a warning here that it's going to delete everything, but we can just hit yes. And then here we're going to set a password for the root user, so I'm just going to type in a password, but you can probably make it a much stronger password than what I just used here. After that we hit enter. Now it's going to ask us if we want to create a 16 gig swap partition on the drive, and since we only have 8 gigs of RAM, I'm going to go ahead and hit enter to create this. After a few minutes, installation should complete, and we can go ahead and hit enter to reboot, and then we'll go ahead and unplug our flash drive as well. When we reboot our system, we should see quite a few minutes of just gibberish fly across the screen, but eventually we should land at this screen, which will show us our current IP address that's been assigned from our DHCP server. And this is actually the last thing we have to do on the actual display of our NAS itself. Everything else we'll actually do from a web browser. So let's hop back over to Google Chrome really quick. And if we actually go ahead and navigate to the IP address that TrueNAS gave us, we should come to this login screen here, where we can log in using root and the password we set earlier. And if everything went well, we should land on this dashboard here. And so far, it looks like everything's working exactly as it should. Now, because our IP address was assigned using DHCP, it's actually possible that this IP address could change. There are two ways we can fix that. One, we could set up a static IP address on this machine, or we can just go to our router settings and set up this IP as an allocated DHCP IP address. We'll start with how to allocate an IP address using DHCP, because our NAS already has an IP address given to it from our DHCP server. Now to do this, you'll have to navigate to your DHCP server, which is most likely your router. I don't know exactly where your router is going to be, so you'll have to figure out that IP address, but once you do, you can navigate to it. For me, it's 192.168.1.1, and I'm going to skip past my login here for obvious security reasons. Now every router control panel is a little bit different, but basically you just need to navigate to the section where it says DHCP, and there should be a list of all the devices that it's given IP addresses to. And so hopefully you can scroll down and find the IP address of our NAS, and then there should be some option to save or allocate that IP address. For me, it's just this little save icon to the right, and then after I click that, if I go over to address reservation, we can see that our NAS's IP address is allocated. Instead of doing it with DHCP though, I actually want to set this up as a static IP address. So I'm going to go over to this network tab, And then we can click on our interface here to bring up some options. Now I'm going to deselect DHCP so that we're not automatically getting assigned an IP address, and we'll assign a static IP address here. So we'll go to IP addresses and add, and then I'm going to use 192.168.1.31, and then we'll leave this /24 here. But it's important to select an IP address that you know isn't in your DHCP range and also isn't being used by another device. If you're not sure, maybe just check the DHCP, but we're going to go ahead and hit apply here. And then we can hit test changes, hit confirm, and in another tab, I'm going to go to 192.168.1.31, and we should land back at our NAS here. We can sign in as root, and we'll hit save changes. So now, our IP address for our NAS is 192.168.1.31, and that's great. Okay, so this is future Colton here. Just need to fix a mistake. When setting up our static IP address, I forgot we actually have to make sure we have a gateway as well as a DNS server. So we can click on our global configuration here, and then under IPv4 default gateway, we can type in 192.168.1.1 or whatever your router is. And then for name server, we'll just do 1.1.1.1 really quick, which is Cloudflare's DNS server. Then we can scroll down and hit save, and now our static IP address should be correctly set up. Okay, so we're back at the dashboard on our new static IP address, and the next thing we're going to do is create a user group. So let's go to credentials and then local groups, and then from here we'll say add groups, and we're going to call this group home. So that way if you wanted to add some people, some home users that all have similar access, and we'll keep this GID or group ID at 1000. And I'm not sure if we need this Samba authentication checked. I can't remember. We're going to go ahead and check it now just because. Why not? Hit save. Once again, I am not an expert. This is taking forever. Okay, so finally, we have our home group created. Let's create a user. So we'll go to local users, then we'll click add, and we'll put our name as just Haven. Our username is Haven. We'll skip email, and we'll use a really strong password. Just kidding, please use a much stronger password than this. But for the sake of this video, I'm just gonna leave it as is. And then user ID, we'll keep it 1000. Instead of this new primary group, let's go ahead and select under primary group. Let's look for our home group that we just created. So we'll scroll down. Is it at the very bottom? Yep, at the very bottom, we have our home group. We'll select that. And then once again, we'll leave everything as is and go ahead and hit save. All right, now that we have our user and group set up, let's go ahead and start creating some storage. So let's go to this storage tab here. And the first thing we need to do is create a pool. And so we're going to hit create pool, and we'll just call this main. I'm sure there's better practices than that, but we're just going to call it main because it's the only pool we're going to have on our NAS because we don't have a lot of drives. And so down here we see our available disks, and we have our two 4 terabyte NAS drives that we put in earlier. So we can select both of these, and then we'll move these into this data VDEV. This VDEV is where all of our actual data is going to be stored. And you can create other VDEVs, but for the sake of this setup, we're just going to have a data VDEV with both of our drives in it. We're also going to select mirror here, which means these drives are going to be identical, which means if one of them fails, we actually can replace it and still not lose any of our data. And we can see our estimated raw capacity is at 3.64 tebibytes. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I'm not really familiar with my tebibytes, but 3.64 tebibytes, which is what we want. And so we can go ahead and hit create. This will delete everything off those disks, which is A-OK. Hit create pool. All right, so now we have our pool created. We need to create a data set now that we can actually set up our share on so we can access from the computers. So we'll go here to add data set, and we're going to call this Haven Samba. And then all these settings can stay the same, except for down here at the bottom where it says share type, we're going to change that from generic to SMB. Now, I guess you could encrypt this drive if you wanted to, and you could maybe play around with different compression level settings, but I'm not an expert. I'm just leaving it as default, and we'll hit save. Okay, so now we have our main pool, and then under that, we have our Haven Samba dataset. So now we're going to set up a share. So we can go over here to shares, and we're going to set up a Samba share, SMB share, because that's going to be the easiest thing, and it's going to work a lot easier with Windows computers. So we can just hit add. And then for path, we're going to select our data set we selected earlier, this Haven Samba. We'll just keep it called Haven Samba. And then everything else, we could add a description if we wanted to, but I'm just going to leave it blank. We can leave default share parameters, and then we're going to hit save. Okay, now we have it created, and we can hit enable service. And this should change from stopped to running. Yep, there we go. So it is running, but if we were to try to access this right now, we actually couldn't because we don't have user access. So what we're going to do is down here where it says view details, we'll hit that. And then on our share here, we can go to this and click edit file system ACL. Then down here, we can click add item, and we're going to add a group. So we can add our home group. So now we can select this drop down. We're going to select our home group that we made earlier, ACL type allow, and then we'll leave all these permissions as they already are, and we will hit save access control list. So now anyone in that home group should have access to our Haven Samba share. So to test that, we're actually going to go to our file explorer, and then we'll navigate to this PC. Ignore some of this stuff down here. But for now, we're going to go to map network drive, and I'm going to map this as, do I have H available? Do I have H for Haven? Oh, I don't. We're just going to map this as S for Samba, I guess. And so what we can do is we can put 2 backslashes, and then our IP address, another backslash, and then the name of our share, which is Haven Samba. And then we can keep this reconnect it sign-in checked, and we should be able to hit finish, and then type in our Haven username and our password. We'll hit remember my credentials, and if everything worked well, haha, we should now have access to our share. So if I were to try to copy over a video, look at that. We've just transferred stuff to our Haven Samba share, and I wonder if we can actually play this video back from it. Look at that. I'm actually playing back a video from our NAS that we just built. How cool is that? With TrueNAS Scale, we can actually run a lot of cool things like virtual machines or containerized applications, some of which are available by default, such as Plex or Nextcloud. But my plan is to leave this server as purely a dedicated storage server. So I'm not going to be running any other applications or virtual machines, but that's definitely something to check out if you're interested. Something you should definitely do though is go to this data protection tab and make sure that scrub tasks are enabled. And you can actually play around with the schedule to make sure this happens more frequently if you'd like to. But basically this is going to check our file system to check for any integrity issues or corruption, and then provide us an early warning if something does happen. Here you can also configure smart tests, which essentially will monitor the health of your drives in your NAS. If the data on your NAS is really important, you probably want to have some sort of offsite backup, such as Backblaze or even Dropbox. Here you can actually configure that by setting up a cloud sync task, but I'm not going to go into that into this video. I might do that sometime later on. As I mentioned earlier in the video, my goal with this build was to try and compete with my 2-bay Synology DS215 Plus. So I copied a folder that was just under 7 gigabytes or so to and from each NAS to see how they performed. With write speeds, the Pavilion TrueNAS is the clear winner here, completing the transfer in almost half the time. The DS215 Plus only has 1 gigabyte of memory, and I think our Pavilion's 8 gigabytes is giving it a massive advantage here. For the majority of the transfer, the Pavilion is able to nearly saturate our gigabit connection, only dipping down a few times, while the Synology starts to really struggle after only a few seconds. My guess is that the Pavilion would have even better write performance over longer periods of time if we decided to upgrade to 16 gigs in the future. Read performance wasn't as impressive for the Pavilion, but it still managed a solid lead over the Synology. I'm sure the RAM and 16GB swap are helpful here, but not as much as during the write test, so both servers are limited by the drive speed, I think. Now, it's great that we managed to beat the Synology in raw performance, but what does that actually look like when we take power draw into consideration? Well, I measured each device using a watt meter at the wall, and the Pavilion 500-C60 really wasn't that much more power hungry, at least at idle. It drew around 30 watts on average, with the Synology pulling only around 20 watts. To me, this seems like a pretty worthwhile trade-off. I'm only measuring and comparing power draw at idle here because I don't think the draw under load will really affect my power bill too much. This NAS will most likely be sitting at idle at least 90% of the time, so that's what I'm much more concerned about. And just to make sure this actually performed well in a real-world environment, I edited this entire video from this NAS. It wasn't flawless, with a few hitches here and there, but for the most part, I forgot that I was editing off the NAS. I actually forgot to turn the NAS back on a few times when I tried to pull this up to finish editing. This TrueNAS server is not perfect, and it took a whole lot of improvising to make it happen. But it's pretty cool that an old desktop like this can actually outperform something name brand off the shelf like a Synology DS215 Plus. Now, obviously Synology products come with software, features, and support that isn't available with a TrueNAS system like this, so this isn't necessarily an apples to apples comparison. But it's still helpful to see what can be done with an old PC lying around. If you have any thoughts or questions about this build, make sure to leave a comment below, and also consider posting it on my Discord server, which you can find a link for that on my channel. And as always, if you liked the video and want to support the channel, the easiest way is to just hit the like button, or maybe consider subscribing if you haven't already. That's all for this one though, so thanks for watching, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.